Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, listeria in waffles and liverwurst, E. coli in quarter pounders. How safe is our food? In this episode, Stephanie Desmond talks to Dr. Meghan Davis, a Johns Hopkins veterinarian, and Dr. Deanne Williams, a former food safety official, about what causes these pathogens to spread. They also talk about the detective work it takes to find outbreaks and steps that we can take to ensure the food we eat won't make us sick. Let's listen.
Meghan Davis and Deanne Williams, thanks so much for joining me.
It's such a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. So let's talk about food safety today. The news is filled with reports of contaminated food, right? So there was this giant frozen waffle recall for listeria and, quarter pounders potentially have E. coli in them. And then we remember over the summer, this deadly outbreak with boar's head lunch meats. So what's going on and why is this happening now, Meghan?
That's a great question. So food safety is a perennial concern. And what happens is we have a pretty good surveillance system in the United States that helps us identify cases that may not even occur around the same place, right? So you might have cases that are distributed in multiple states, but we have a system that lets us understand through genetic fingerprinting that these cases might be related. And this is part of why we tend to hear about these outbreaks being larger and affecting more people, because we are able to do this kind of trace back using the system that we have.
So are there more cases or is there more surveillance?
So probably a little bit of both. When you have outbreaks, they can be bigger. And that's in part because some of the companies are making very large batches. The distribution networks are pretty extensive. And so when you have an outbreak, you might be able to identify more cases associated with it. This is in contrast to, I think, what people learn in Epi 101, which is your classic outbreak investigation at the picnic, where you have maybe ice cream or potato salad that's implicated. In this case, we've had a lot of different kinds of foods, and some of them have traced back to organisms that can be a little bit interesting, right? So they can survive at temperatures that are a little bit cooler than you might expect.
Well, I'm going to ask you a little more about listeria in a moment, but Dee, I wanted to ask you sort of the promise of the American food supply is that I'm not going to get sick if I eat food that has been inspected and all of that stuff. Should I be nervous? Should we be changing our eating habits?
No. I think, as Meghan said, the U.S. food supply is very safe. And a lot of the reasons why it's very safe is because we do have these surveillance systems in place, as well as food safety processes like HACCP, which is Hazardous Control of Critical Control Points, which is used in most retail as well as manufacturing settings. And so, unfortunately, sometimes those critical control points get violated. A lot of times equipment can become contaminated, and given the size of the food system and the size of some of these manufacturing facilities and the distribution of that food, it can get all over the country as well as in other countries as well, as we're doing some export of those products.
So, Meghan, let's talk about listeria. What is it? How does it get in our food? And how is it surviving in processed food? I think that the waffle that was cooked in the plant was cooked and it should be fine.
Right. So this comes back to the critical control points that Dee was talking about, where if you have the opportunity for contamination after one of those control steps, for example, the cooking of the waffle, then that means that you might have it at a place where people would expect it to be without any adulteration. In other words, without these bacteria called listeria, but in fact, they may be present. And listeria are particularly problematic for pregnant women, and they're more often found in cheeses, but now we've seen them associated with deli meat and waffles. So this is in part because of the environmental persistence that we can find with this bacterium.
It's lasting longer than it has before, or it's more powerful? Dee?
I'll take that. So it's not that it's lasting longer or it's more powerful. It's a very tricky kind of bacteria, and it lives in a lot of nooks and crannies in facilities. And so what can end up happening is that during the processing procedure, if the product, even though it's been cooked, contacts one of those areas, then it can become inoculated with listeria, for example. And then even freezing it or putting it in a refrigerator doesn't kill the bacteria and actually allows the bacteria to possibly grow in the product itself.
So that frozen waffle, is it going to make me sick if I eat it raw or frozen, or is it going to make me sick even after it's been cooked?
So as long as you get it to the right temperature for the right amount of time, you can absolutely kill these bacteria, listeria and E. coli. The issue is that sometimes you find it on foods that people will tend to eat without necessarily cooking to those temperatures, or that are on foods that are like deli meats where you're slicing it and using it as is. And so that means that there's not an additional step that would inactivate it. This is part of why some pregnant women are advised by their physicians that they should cook their deli meat, have hot sandwiches instead of having cold cuts.
So Meghan, what are the symptoms of listeria and E. coli? What should we look out for?
They're somewhat different. So E. coli is a classic enteric pathogen, meaning, we eat it and it causes some gastrointestinal upset. There are some kinds of E. coli that can cause more severe disease, such as hemolytic uremic syndrome. Listeria is a little bit more interesting. Some people will just have fever, tiredness. Others will have actually some neurologic symptoms. And some of these symptoms can occur a little bit later than you might expect because the incubation period can be longer than what is maybe more common that people think about with other kinds of foodborne illnesses.
And people die from both of them.
Yes, it is possible. I would say I get a little more concerned about listeria in older adults, immunocompromised people, and pregnant women, but certainly there are strains of E. coli that can be fatal.
So I asked this question. I only know the answer to this is because I ran into you guys in a restaurant. But Dee, do you eat out in a restaurant? How do you trust that the food? It feels like the riskiest thing we do is to go to a restaurant and let someone else cook for us.
Right. Well, and I suppose that's probably true. But at the same time, if there are in some jurisdictions, they do grading where they'll let you know exactly what the food handling procedures are and whether or not a place is safe to eat. But at the same time, retail facilities also have food safety requirement for food safety certification, as well as having people take food safety courses. So they should really understand what they're doing, and you should be able to trust those facilities, I think.
And I'll just add, it probably depends on how good you are at food handling at home. If you're someone who tends to slice the raw meat and then slice the raw vegetables on the same board, that's a very tricky practice, right? That's exactly how you can contaminate foods that you might eat raw with some of the bacteria that can be present on things like raw meat. But if your food handling practices are really great, then, especially if you are immunocompromised, you may think about where you want to eat and whether it's something where you want to have more control over the way your food is prepared.
Sure. Hand washing is also critical as well.
Yes, at home and in the restaurant.
That's correct.
I'm curious about, since the listeria at the Boar's Head with the deli meat over the summer, we're a little bit of a distance away from that now. And so we understand more about how that one happened. And I'm wondering, Dee, if you want to tell us a little bit about what happened, what we've learned, and how we do better next time.
Yeah, absolutely. So So one of the things that was found during the inspection at the Boar's Head facility in Virginia was that there was a history of insanitary conditions where, there was poor cleaning processes. A lot of the food processing surfaces were contaminated or had food waste on it. So they hadn't been doing a very good job of continuing to make sure that the facility was cleaned. I mean, most manufacturing facilities have a shutdown period almost in between every batch where they actually will clean the surfaces and make sure that the surfaces are cleaned. And state governments usually are the ones that do those inspections for the FDA. And some states are a little bit better than others in making sure that those processes are handled and as facilities are inspected at a proper frequency.
Meghan, Virginia knew that this plant had had a history of not being sanitary, and yet the facility remained open and produced liverwurst that killed a lot of people. So why was this allowed to stay open?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I recognize that there's probably a tension sometimes within states in terms of trying to get companies to have an incentive to start, changing their practices. But there can also be bacteria that are really intractable and very difficult to get rid of. I know, Dee, you've told me some stories about some plants that had to basically raise the building to the ground and start over because of certain kinds of contamination. So certainly hindsight in this case is 2020. And in retrospect, given some of the prior findings, that I think the plant is still closed. Is that right, Dee?
I think you're right. I think you're right about that. I think that they have not reopened the plant.
So sometimes the only way to get rid of it, Dee, is to knock the place down?
Absolutely. There were a couple of cases in particular, even in retail facilities, where they found some salmonella they were just unable to get rid of it. There were just periodic outbreaks associated with this particular facility. And so they basically had to close it and actually bulldoze it to prevent more people from becoming ill.
Meghan, do we think any of this has to do with climate change? Are these organisms getting stronger?
So we don't really expect these bacteria to necessarily become stronger, right? Like this is some kind of Marvel character. What we do worry about, though, is that as we put more and more selective pressure on them, often through use of disinfectants and antibiotics and other chemicals, that we can select for more resistant organisms, and that makes them more difficult to treat. So when we have multi-drug resistant organisms where, we've already used up some of our arsenal of treatments, we can't, we've got to go to treatments that may be a little bit more harmful for people. They're definitely not kind of the first ones that we would reach for. We only reach for them in the case of a more resistant infection. What we do see with climate change, though, is just changes within the food system writ large. And this can also mean stressors within crop production, stressors within food animal production. And whenever you have stressors on the system, that can be a place where pathogens tend to thrive a little bit more. So I wouldn't say that there's a direct link, but I do think about stresses in the system.
And Dee, how safe should I feel eating in a restaurant?
I think that you should use your best judgment. If you go in, you observe weird restaurant handling procedures or something, I think you should turn around and walk out. But at the same time, I think you should trust that we have a food inspection service in most places that do a pretty good job of making sure that restaurants are safe to eat in.
Meghan, the last word to you.
I just say, in terms of food safety, when you're preparing food at home, use really good food handling practices, right? So, and I've been saying this for a couple of months now, don't drink raw milk, not just because of E. coli and other bacteria, but also because of H5N1, an avian influenza virus. And also, please take care when handling and preparing any raw food product. If you're someone who has a health condition, seek additional advice from your medical provider, and they can help you understand a little bit better what maybe your specific risk factors might be. That'll be a little bit different for someone who doesn't have an underlying health condition.
Yeah, and I'd like to add one more thing. So definitely, especially with Thanksgiving coming, make sure that you are washing your hands, cooking things to the proper temperature, holding things at proper temperatures, especially when you have things out and you're waiting for dinner to happen. You want to make sure that things are held at the proper temperature to keep bacteria from growing inside products.
Dee Williams and Meghan Davis, thank you again for joining me.
Sure, thanks.
A pleasure.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.